question.
Thank you, Vanessa. Hi, Tom.
Hello.
My question pertains to a recent, in the last few months, interview you did with Bernardo Castro.
Mm-hmm.
And near the end, you were talking about a paradigm shift from materialism to idealism. Do I have that right?
Mm-hmm. That's correct.
And so I discussed this with my local MBT group because I really didn't know what was meant by idealism. And what they told me is that consciousness is fundamental. Is that right?
Yes, that's basically, well, that's maybe some idealists would come up with something else, but that's really, as far as MBT goes, that's what makes us idealists, yes, is that consciousness is fundamental.
So my question sort of pertains to Richard Gordon and the documentary that he's in the process of making right now. Because I understand the premise of this documentary is, what if a paradigm shift happens before the world is ready for it? And I don't know, I haven't really formulated the question really well, but it's Bernardo and you and idealism and Richard Gordon. And is the world ready for, well, no, I don't want to say it like that. What do you imagine the repercussions could be if this were to take place before the world was ready for it?
Well, one good thing is that it doesn't really take place, or it really can't take place until the world is almost ready for it, or at least potentially ready for it. So as long as we are still full of fear and cannot process it, cannot deal with it, it's just out of our reality to be kind to people just because that's nice. That's you only interact with people in as much as what can I get, what can they do for me. If we're still in that mindset, then it won't happen. So it only happens when we change to the point that we can entertain bigger pictures and bigger ideas and ideas of love and compassion and cooperation. When that becomes wide enough spread, then things start to happen. So it remains in the margins, which is what it has been for, human beings have been walking around as Homo sapiens for about 200,000 years. And for those 200,000 years, all of them except maybe the last 100 or so, we haven't progressed much. We've been pretty hard-headed and not very grown up. But in the last few hundred years, I even say as long as 500 years, we've been growing up and we've been changing. Life is a lot better now than it was 500 years ago. Life was real cheap in those days. There wasn't a whole lot of caring on a broad scale. There was individually in families, but on a broad scale, there was very little of that. All of our social organization was in the lines of the warlord mentality. Someone who had all the power was in charge and made all the rules. Everybody else had to obey the rules or deal with the consequences. And we're getting away from that, and we have been now for some time. Now we haven't gotten to the point yet, though, that we're ready to create this big paradigm shift, but we're inching up on it. We're getting ready, and now that we have humanity as a community, and that's something that the internet has done. Now we have a situation where probably over half the population of the world is on the net. We're connected with each other. Probably more than half of the people in the world are on the net. So what that does is make us more of a community. If you go back even just 100 years ago, when there was a earthquake, in someplace else, And we'd say, oh, yeah, we hear that. They had an earthquake and 100,000 people were killed. Oh, that's too bad. We didn't have any connection to it. It was just something that happened in some place, and most of us didn't even know where that someplace was on a map. We wouldn't even be able to find it. Just 100 years ago or so. And now that's not true. Now we hear about it, we see it, we watch people going through it. We can look in their faces, we can see the expressions on their face, and that makes it so much more real, and it makes it so much more likely that we'll have empathy or sympathy or send some of our resources, to organizations that are helping them and that sort of thing. So this connectedness is growing. And as that happens, that gives us bigger picture. We don't see ourselves as just an isolated, little group of people. If we go back 100 years, you'll find out that very few people, ever got further than, about 100 miles from where they were born. They were born there, grew up there, worked there, died there. Well, that's not true anymore. People are traveling all over because we have airplanes that put us from one side of the world to the other in less than a day. So all of the technology has been helping us make humanity into a single tribe, into, people we care about. Now, we're just starting down that path. 100 years isn't very long. 100 years is a very short period of time. So particularly 100 years out of 200,000, it's an eye blink. But we're heading in that direction. And now I see in our culture lots and lots of people who are talking about bigger ideas, like, the talk with Bernardo. He is talking about idealism, and a lot of other people talk about idealism, and that was given its name back in Plato's time. And it was the idealists who said, this world that you see is not exactly what's most real. It's just a shadow of the real world. In the Buddha's word, this is all an illusion. This is not what's real. Well, Plato said the same thing with his cave allegory. What we think's the world is just like shadows on the cave wall. So we've had this idea that what is fundamental is not the physical. So that's been called idealism. Things are, it's like in the real world, we don't have perfect circles. A perfect circle is just a mathematical thing. It's an ideal thing. So it started with mathematics. It was called ideal. So in the world that's really fundamental, you have perfect circles. You have, everything's ideal. And then we have this world that is not. The opposite to that is realism. Realism says what you see is all there is. The physical is it. There's nothing besides the physical. So those two have been competing with each other since, I don't know, probably 500 or 600 BC, those two concepts. And the philosophers have been arguing with each other without a whole lot of success right up until the early 1920s, when the double slit experiment was done. And when that was done, that was the key that the idealists were right and the realists were wrong. Because from a realist viewpoint, that all there is this physical world. From a viewpoint of materialism, which is physicalism, which is the reality group, or the realist group, what happens in the double slit is just impossible. It just can't happen. There is no physical explanation. It has no physical causality, but it happens anyway. And you can repeat that experiment as many times as you like, as many places, and it's always the same. There is no physical causality for what happens. Well, that tells us then that this world is not just physical. There's something else going on besides just the physical. So that was really the first piece of scientific information that said the idealists were right and the realists were not. And since then, of course, there's been many other experiments in quantum physics besides the double slit that keep saying the same thing, keep making the same point over and over again. And I have a few experiments that are also going to make that point, in my own way. So that's kind of what the idealism and material, versus materialism is. And it's had thousands of philosophers over the millennia arguing on both sides of it. So it's a real big thing in philosophy. And I guess there are some that don't accept the idea that because there's no material causality that the materialists are wrong. But I think that's a fact. That's clear enough. It's like that. So anyway, are we ready? Is your question, and not yet. But I think we will be in the near future, because I think the fact that we have communications now means that big ideas don't stay just in the margins. We've had a lot of people who have had big ideas. It's not just new happening now that we have a lot of people with bigger ideas. The idealists, like I say, go back to, I don't know how many, probably 500 or 600 years BC. So people have been aware, and the Buddha goes back to about 2,500 years ago, where he said this was all an illusion. What was really important was love and caring and compassion and that sort of thing. But all these ideas have hung out in the margins. They've not been mainstream. The mainstream has always said, yeah, that's a nice idea, but it's not going to help me find something to eat. So it's not important. So it's just always been in the margins. And now, I think that's not the case. We can see now all the dysfunction we have. And if I think if you did a survey amongst all the people on the planet, you'd find that most people agree that our world is dysfunctional, that it could be a lot better. It's not optimized. We've got a lot of unpleasant, negative, wrong things going on here. We should change, but nobody has a clue how to go about doing that, because still the people, the humans, have a pretty low quality of consciousness. So, it's hard to change that. It's hard to get a bunch of 6-year-olds to act like adults. It's just really hard. They just have to grow up. They're not going to act like adults, even if you have adults around and say, boy, it sure would be nice if all these kids would act like adults. It's just not going to happen. You have to let them grow up. So they're going to squabble and fight and grab each other's toys and run with scissors and do all the other things that kids do that adults wish they wouldn't, but they do anyway. But now I think the possibility for them growing up in the mainstream is in the near future. So no, we're not ready yet. But when we are ready, that means enough of us are ready that we can make that change. We can begin that change. If just 10% of the people on the planet changed and grew up and could walk away from their fears and were considerate and cooperative and whatever, that would make a huge difference, just 10%, because that 10% would be such a good example and would have smiles on their face and be happy and live lives of joy. And that would trigger, growth all over the place, because people would say, I'd like to be like that. I'd like to live with happiness instead of, misery and pain and frustration. So just 10% might be enough. So we don't have to wait till everybody's there. We just have to wait till there's enough there that they can eventually win the rest over. And I think we're getting close to that point because of the internet, because of our communications, because of our transportation. We're having bigger pictures and realizing that other people who think and live differently than us are not necessarily wrong. They're just different. And we need to accept those differences as just differences. So I think we're on our way, and we're changing more rapidly over the last 100 years than we had changed in the 199,000 years before that. Just in the last 100 years, we've made more change than we had in all the time before it. So that's good. And I think that rate of change is just going to keep speeding up. Now, we could do something foolish and set ourselves back. Evolution doesn't always just march forward. Sometimes it gets set back, but it's very resilient, and it'll come back again, and it'll be easier next time. So I'm thinking 2, 3 decades, 4 decades, probably in this century, we'll get to a point where we'll be ready to get maybe 10 or 15% of us in the world that are on the same sheet of music. So it's just a matter of spreading that word and those ideas so that people see that there is a better way than just control, power, force, which is kind of the ethic. That's kind of the coin of the realm now, is control, power, force. And we need to see that's dysfunctional. That's not a good coin. That's not really the way we should be. So we're coming up on it. And no, we're not ready, but we will be. But nothing's going to force us to change until we're ready. So the concept that the change will come and we're not ready, I don't think will happen. The change will only come when enough of us get ready that we can influence the rest. So I don't think it's a problem about not being ready for the change. It won't happen until enough of us are ready to actually start to change everybody else.
That's a wonderful answer. Thanks.
Yeah.
Thanks, Tom.